Winter in Cedar Grove, Wisconsin is a particular kind of quiet. The snow muffles everything. Car engines, voices, even the wind itself seems to hold its breath. In late December 2001, the streetlights along Maple Ridge cast amber pools across fresh powder, and the Hartley family's porch bulb flickered with that tired rhythm only old wiring produces. Inside, Linda Hartley was folding laundry in the living room, sorting her son Aaron's flannel shirts and jeans with the practiced efficiency of a mother who'd done this for 16 years. On the coat rack by the door hung his red scarf, the one with the frayed tassels she'd knitted 2 winters prior, slightly lopsided but warm. Aaron had wrapped it around his neck that morning before heading out for his paper route, joking that it made him look like a pilot from an old war movie. The scarf would become something else entirely in the days to come, a marker, a memory, a question that wouldn't answer itself for nearly 2 decades. Aaron left the house at 5:40 that morning, his bicycle tires leaving thin tracks in the new snow. He had 43 papers to deliver along a route that looped through residential streets and crossed the old stone bridge over Cedar Creek before circling back. His father, Tom, had reminded him to be careful on the bridge. It iced over first, always had. Aaron waved without looking back, his breath visible in the cold air, the red scarf trailing behind him like a small flag. He should have been home by 7:15, maybe 7:30, if he stopped to talk with Mr. Patterson, the retired postal worker who always asked about school. By 8 o'clock, Linda was standing at the kitchen window watching the street. By 8:30, Tom was in the car, driving the route backward, his hands tight on the wheel. They found the bicycle first. It was lying in the ditch just past the bridge, front wheel bent at an unnatural angle, newspapers scattered across the embankment like white birds that couldn't fly. The red scarf was tangled in the spokes, half submerged in snow. Tom stood there for a long moment, the cold working through his coat, before he radioed the police dispatcher he knew from Rotary Club meetings. His voice was steady when he spoke, but his hands were shaking so badly he had to try twice to get the radio back in its holster. The temperature that morning was 19 degrees. The water in Cedar Creek, black and fast-moving beneath the ice at the edges, was colder still. The mobilization was immediate and comprehensive. By noon, the Cedar Grove Volunteer Fire Department had launched an organized ground search, with teams fanning out from the bridge in expanding rings. Neighboring counties sent K9 units, German shepherds trained in cold water scent tracking, their handlers moving methodically along the creek bed. Linda sat in the volunteer center set up in the Methodist church basement, answering the same questions over and over to officers who wrote everything down with careful precision. What was he wearing? Blue jeans, a gray Wisconsin Badgers hoodie, white sneakers, the red scarf. Any problems at school? No, he was doing fine. B student, played JV basketball, had a small group of friends. Did he seem upset, worried, different in any way that morning? No, he'd been normal. He'd been Aaron. If you're watching this and thinking about someone you haven't heard from in too long, or if stories like this one pull at something you can't quite name, subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. These stories matter because someone, somewhere, is still waiting for an answer. Dive teams arrived by the second day, working in shifts in water so cold their exposure time was measured in minutes. They dragged the creek bed with methodical care, finding shopping carts, a rusted lawnmower, a child's tricycle from decades past, but no body. A psychic from Milwaukee offered her services, walking the bridge with her eyes closed, speaking about energy and water and a presence she couldn't quite locate. The police logged her input professionally, but followed the evidence instead. They interviewed every household on Aaron's route, collected statements from the bus driver who'd seen him that morning, reviewed security footage from the gas station 2 blocks from the bridge. The footage showed Aaron pedaling past at 5:52, his breath visible, the red scarf bright even in the grainy recording. A promising lead emerged on day 5. A trucker reported seeing a teenage boy matching Aaron's description at a rest stop 40 miles south on Highway 41, standing near the vending machines and looking disoriented. Police rushed to review surveillance tapes and found the boy, but it wasn't Aaron. Different nose, different build, different life entirely. The false positive hit Linda harder than she expected. She'd allowed herself for 3 hours to imagine the reunion, to plan what she'd say, how she'd hold him. The letdown left her hollow. Weeks became months. The official search was scaled back, then suspended. The community never quite forgot. Yellow ribbons stayed tied to trees along Maple Ridge through spring and summer, but the acute crisis faded into chronic sorrow. Tom returned to his job at the lumber mill, moving through his shifts with a mechanical quality his co-workers pretended not to notice. Linda kept Aaron's room exactly as he'd left it, his basketball posters on the wall, his homework still stacked on the desk, waiting for a hand that wouldn't return to complete it. The insurance company processed the claim with bureaucratic efficiency, requiring a waiting period, documentation, witness statements. The death certificate, when it finally came, felt like a betrayal, even as it offered a strange kind of permission to grieve openly. The headstone was placed in the Cedar Grove cemetery in spring 2003, under an oak tree that would shade it in summer. The inscription was simple: Aaron Michael Hartley, 1985-2001, beloved son. Linda visited every Sunday after church, bringing fresh flowers, speaking to the stone as though it might answer. Tom came less frequently, unable to reconcile the marble marker with the absence of a body, the finality of dates with the persistent, irrational hope that flickered in his chest when he saw teenage boys from behind, their shoulders familiar, their walk almost right. The toll of grief is rarely dramatic. It's the everyday erosions, the birthday cakes never baked, the Christmas stockings folded away, the college brochures that arrive addressed to a ghost. Linda took a part-time job at the library, needing structure, needing to be around other people's stories instead of drowning in her own. Tom started attending a support group for parents of missing children, sitting in folding chairs in church basements, listening to others describe the particular torture of not knowing. Some had bodies, closure, funerals. Others, like him, existed in liminal space, unable to fully mourn or fully hope. The group met every Thursday evening in the basement of St. Michael's Lutheran Church, and Tom found an unexpected comfort in the ritual of coffee from a 20-cup percolator, and the company of people who understood that hope and despair aren't opposites, but twins. Years passed with the peculiar acceleration of middle age. The Hartleys moved through rituals, work, church, library board meetings, Sunday dinners at Tom's sister's house, where his nieces and nephews grew up and graduated and married, while Aaron remained frozen at 16. They didn't talk about Aaron as much, not because they'd forgotten, but because the language for their loss had worn smooth with repetition. Friends stopped asking. New neighbors never knew. The house on Maple Ridge became a museum of normal life, built over a foundation of unresolved trauma, every room containing small shrines they pretended weren't there. Aaron's baseball glove still sat on the shelf in the garage. His favorite mug, the one with the Green Bay Packers logo, remained in the cupboard, unused but not discarded. Procedurally, Aaron's case remained open but inactive. In law enforcement terminology, it was classified as a presumed drowning with no body recovered, a category that exists in a frustrating gray zone between missing and deceased. Detective Sarah Chen, who joined the Cedar Grove Department in 2009, fresh from the police academy in Madison, inherited a filing cabinet full of cold cases, and Aaron's was among them. She'd pull the file during slow weeks, reviewing statements, looking for something previous investigators had missed. She'd learned about CODIS during her training, the combined DNA index system that cross-references genetic profiles from crime scenes, missing persons, and unidentified remains across the country. Aaron's DNA profile, collected from his toothbrush and hairbrush in 2001, sat in the database like a patient sentinel, waiting for a match that never came. Chen also familiarized herself with NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which maintains cross-state databases and produces age progression imagery for long-term missing cases. In 2011, she submitted Aaron's case for age progression, and a forensic artist used specialized software to predict what a 26-year-old Aaron might look like. Fuller face, different hairline, the subtle changes time etches into bone structure and skin. The image was distributed through law enforcement channels, posted on missing persons' websites, shared in bolo bulletins that circulated through truck stops and bus stations. Nothing came back. The silence became its own kind of answer. What they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that Aaron's name hadn't been Aaron for over a decade. He'd become Marcus Webb, a name given to him by people who understood that erasing identity is the first step in erasing a person. He'd lived in 6 different states under that name, moved through transient labor systems where documentation was flexible and questions were discouraged. He'd worked construction in Tennessee, agricultural processing in Iowa, landscaping in Illinois. He'd learned to keep his head down, to accept that the life he'd known was gone, to survive in the margins where missing people often hide in plain sight. The turn came from the most mundane of sources: a routine tax audit. In 2017, the Wisconsin Department of Revenue implemented new software to cross-reference tax records, Social Security numbers, and employment databases, searching for discrepancies that might indicate fraud or identity theft. The algorithm was designed to catch people cheating the system, but it caught something else instead. It flagged an anomaly, a Social Security number registered to Aaron Michael Hartley, officially marked as deceased in 2003, showing W-2 income from Prairie View Landscaping in Rockford, Illinois, for the tax years 2015, 2016, and 2017. The automated system generated a report and routed it to a fraud investigator named Dennis Walsh, who'd been processing these flags for 12 years and had seen everything from clerical errors to elaborate identity theft rings. This one was different. Walsh spent 30 seconds on Google and found Aaron's missing person case, the news articles from 2001, the age progression image from 2011. He sat back in his chair, coffee going cold in his hand, and realized he wasn't looking at fraud. He was looking at something that shouldn't be possible. Walsh contacted the Rockford Police Department, who contacted Detective Chen, who received the call on a Tuesday afternoon while finishing paperwork on a burglary case. She listened to the Rockford detective explain the situation twice before she trusted herself to respond. She asked them to sit on the information for 24 hours while she drove down. She didn't want this handled over the phone. She didn't want any mistakes. Chen arrived in Rockford the next morning with the original case file, the age progression image, and a DNA collection kit in a sterile evidence bag. She met with Rockford detectives, obtained the employment records for Prairie View Landscaping through an emergency warrant, and found the personnel file for Marcus Webb. The photo on the file showed a gaunt man in his early 30s with deep-set eyes that carried too much knowledge, a beard that couldn't quite hide the bone structure beneath, and a small scar above his left eyebrow. Linda Hartley had mentioned that scar in her original statement 16 years earlier. Aaron had gotten it at age 7, falling from a swing set, requiring 3 stitches from Dr. Morrison. Jen found Marcus Webb at a residential property on the north side of Rockford, kneeling in a flower bed, trimming azaleas with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this work for years. She parked across the street, watching him work for a moment, gathering herself. She'd rehearsed what she'd say during the 2-hour drive, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt inadequate. She crossed the street, her badge visible on her belt, and when she was 10 feet away, she said his name. Not Marcus. Aaron. He looked up, and she saw it immediately. The recognition, the fear, the desperate hope that he might be wrong about what this meant. He stood slowly, the pruning shears still in his hand, dirt on his knees, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Chen asked if he was Aaron Michael Hartley from Cedar Grove, Wisconsin. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said something she would never forget. "I didn't think anyone was still looking." The identification process took 3 days of careful, methodical verification because some things are too important to rush. Chen brought him to the Rockford police station, not under arrest but under protection, and they began the documentation process. She called in a forensic dentist who compared dental x-rays faxed from Dr. Morrison's office in Cedar Grove. The records had been archived but not destroyed. The match was definitive. A slightly rotated lateral incisor on the upper left, 2 amalgam fillings, a unique cusp pattern on the lower molars that's as individual as a fingerprint. The DNA comparison took longer. Chen collected a buccal swab, logged it into evidence, and sent it to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab with a priority flag. The lab compared it against the reference sample collected in 2001 from Aaron's hairbrush, running the analysis twice to eliminate any possibility of error. The result came back 72 hours later, 97% probability of a match. The man who'd been living as Marcus Webb for 17 years was, without any scientific doubt, Aaron Michael Hartley. Detective Chen made the call to the Hartleys from her office in Cedar Grove after driving back, the DNA report in front of her, her hand unsteady on the phone. She'd made difficult calls before, death notifications, arrest warrants, guilty verdicts, but nothing like this. Linda answered on the 3rd ring, and Chen could hear the television in the background, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening. Chen identified herself, heard Linda's immediate tension, police calls are never good news, and then said the words she'd practiced. "Mrs. Hartley, we've found Aaron. He's alive, he's safe, and he wants to see you." The silence on the other end stretched so long, Chen thought the line had dropped. Then Linda made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something raw and primal that came from a place beyond language, and Tom's voice cut in, demanding details, confirmation, proof, anything to anchor this impossible information to reality. Chen gave them what she could: the DNA results, the dental match, the location, the circumstances. She told them Aaron was being evaluated by medical professionals, that he was physically healthy, that a reunion could be arranged within days. The official reunion was scheduled for the following Monday, giving everyone time to prepare, to process, to assemble the support systems that would be needed. Trauma specialists were consulted. A neutral location was chosen, a family services center with private rooms and staff trained in complex reunification cases. But on Friday evening, 3 days after the DNA results came back, before any of the careful arrangements could be implemented, Aaron drove to Cedar Grove himself. He'd borrowed a co-worker's truck, a Ford F-150 with rust on the wheel wells and a broken radio. He'd driven the 2 hours from Rockford to Cedar Grove using muscle memory, some part of his brain that still held the map of these roads, these streets, this exact route to the house where he'd grown up. He parked 2 blocks away and sat in the truck for 20 minutes, watching the porch light, gathering courage. The light flickered. It had always flickered. He remembered that now, something about the wiring that Tom had never quite fixed. He walked to the door carrying something he'd kept hidden for 17 years, wrapped in plastic inside his work bag, never quite able to throw it away. He stood on the porch under that flickering light, his hand raised to knock, and for a moment he couldn't do it. Then he thought about Detective Chen's words, about his parents still waiting, still hoping, and he knocked. Tom opened the door. He'd been watching a Brewers game, Linda reading a library book beside him on the couch, the kind of quiet evening they'd had thousands of times. Tom looked at the stranger on his porch, gaunt, bearded, dressed in work clothes, and his brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. There was a beat of confusion, the automatic assumption of a salesman or a lost driver, and then Linda appeared behind him. She saw the scar above his eyebrow, the specific shape of his ears, the way he stood with his weight shifted to his left foot, and she knew immediately. Mothers know. "Aaron," she said, his name a question and a prayer and a statement all at once. He nodded, unable to speak, and pulled the red scarf from his bag. It was faded, the wool thin in places, one tassel missing, but unmistakably the same scarf Linda had knitted 18 winters earlier. "I kept it," he managed, his voice rough. "I always kept it." Linda reached for him, her hands shaking, and Tom made a sound like air being punched from his chest. They stood in the doorway, the cold March air spilling in, and for a long moment no one knew what to do. 17 years pressed between them, a chasm of lost time, lost conversations, lost ordinary moments that could never be recovered. But Aaron was here, solid and real, and Linda pulled him into her arms with a strength that surprised all of them. The story Aaron told, over weeks of careful interviews with detectives, FBI agents and trauma specialists, threaded through patterns they'd seen before, but never fully mapped. It began with grooming, a man approaching him during his paper route, someone who'd been watching for weeks, learning his schedule, identifying the vulnerable moments. The initial contact seemed innocent, a disabled vehicle, a request to deliver a message to a house down the street, the kind of small favor a helpful 16-year-old might agree to without question. The coercion escalated quickly after that first compliance. Aaron was taken to a house 20 miles away, held there for 3 weeks while his captors assessed him, broke down his resistance, began the process of erasing who he'd been. They told him his family thought he was dead, that the police had stopped looking, that going back would put his parents in danger. They showed him fabricated news articles about the search being called off, about memorial services, about his parents moving on. The lies were specific enough to seem credible, especially to a terrified teenager with no way to verify the truth. He was moved through a network that operated across state lines, a loose affiliation of people who trafficked in labor exploitation. This wasn't the sensationalized version of trafficking people imagine, locked rooms and chains. It was more insidious: coercion, economic control, isolation, and the systematic destruction of identity. Aaron was given the name Marcus Webb, provided with forged documents, moved every 8 to 16 months to avoid detection. He worked construction sites where safety violations were routine and questions were discouraged. He worked agricultural processing facilities where the workforce was deliberately transient. He worked landscaping crews where payment was cash and records were flexible. The psychological mechanism that kept him compliant for so long is called complex trauma bonding, a survival adaptation where the brain prioritizes immediate safety over long-term freedom. His captors used a calculated mix of threats and small kindnesses, punishment and occasional privilege, keeping him off balance, unable to form a coherent plan for escape. Add to that the shame of being a male victim, the cultural narratives that say men should be able to fight back, should be able to escape. And the years stacked up until going back seemed impossible. Who would believe him? How could he explain why he hadn't run sooner, fought harder, found a way? He tried to leave twice. The first time was in Tennessee when he was 19. He'd saved $70 in cash, hidden in his work boot, and walked to a Greyhound station with a vague plan to get to Chicago, to find someone who might help. He was found within 4 hours, brought back, and locked in a storage shed for 3 days with minimal food and water as punishment. The second attempt came when he was 24, working in Iowa. He'd built up enough trust to be left unsupervised occasionally, and he walked into a public library, sat down at a computer, and Googled his own name. What he found devastated him. His obituary, his memorial page, his parents' statements about finding closure. The fabrications his captors had shown him years earlier were true. He was legally dead. Going back seemed pointless. What finally broke the pattern was bureaucratic necessity. In 2015, Prairie View Landscaping in Rockford, trying to comply with new labor audit requirements, needed proper documentation for all employees. The owner, who wasn't part of the trafficking network but asked few questions about his workers' backgrounds, required social security cards and tax information. Aaron, living as Marcus Webb, provided the only numbers he actually knew, his real social security number. He assumed it was flagged as deceased, that it wouldn't process, that he'd lose the job. Instead, the system accepted it, payroll went through, and W-2 forms were filed with the IRS. He never imagined that 2 years later, a software algorithm would flag the discrepancy and start the chain reaction that would bring Detective Chen to that work site. The aftermath of Aaron's return was neither simple nor immediate, because recovery from 17 years of exploitation doesn't happen in tearful reunions and tied-up loose ends. Linda wanted to hold him every moment, to fill every gap, to make up for all the lost time in one desperate embrace. Aaron needed distance, boundaries, time to reconcile the teenager he'd been with the man he'd become. The collision of those needs required professional mediation. They began therapy immediately. Aaron in individual sessions with a specialist in long-term trauma and captivity. The family in group sessions focused on reunion and reintegration. The therapist explained concepts like ambiguous loss, the grief that comes from mourning someone who's still alive, and how that grief doesn't simply vanish when the person returns. She explained trauma responses, dissociation, hypervigilance, the ways Aaron's nervous system had adapted to survive, and how those adaptations would take years to rewire. She helped Linda and Tom understand that their son had returned, but not unchanged, and that accepting the changes was an act of love as important as the reunion itself. Legally, Aaron's case became part of a larger federal investigation. The FBI's field office in Milwaukee took jurisdiction, and Aaron's testimony, combined with evidence from 11 other recovered victims who'd been trafficked through the same network, led to indictments against 7 people. The charges included kidnapping, forced labor, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and identity fraud. The prosecutions took 3 years, with trials in 3 different states. Aaron testified twice, once in federal court in Illinois, once in Tennessee. He wore a suit Linda bought him for the occasion, and his hands gripped the witness stand edge so hard his knuckles went white. But his voice stayed steady as he walked the jury through the timeline of his exploitation. 5 of the 7 defendants were convicted and received sentences ranging from 18 to 35 years. 2 accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against others in the network. Aaron attended the sentencing hearings, wanting to see it through, wanting to reclaim his story by telling it under oath on the record in a context where his words had legal weight and consequences. Reintegration meant rebuilding everything from scratch. Aaron needed reissued identification, a driver's license that proved he existed, a social security card that wasn't flagged as deceased, a birth certificate that could anchor him to his legal identity. He needed medical care for chronic health issues that had gone untreated, a shoulder injury from construction work, dental problems, persistent back pain. He needed job training and education to fill the gaps in his interrupted life. He needed to learn how to exist in the world without the constant calculation of threat, the reflexive hiding, the assumption that safety was temporary. He moved into an apartment 6 blocks from his parents' house, close enough for Sunday dinners and impromptu visits, far enough to establish autonomy and boundaries. The first year was the hardest. He struggled with insomnia, waking at 3 in the morning in a panic, convinced he was back in Tennessee or Iowa, that Cedar Grove was the dream and exploitation was the reality. He struggled with hypervigilance, unable to relax in public spaces, constantly scanning for exits and threats. He struggled with the mundane decisions of normal life, what to eat, what to wear, how to spend unstructured time, because for 17 years those decisions had been made for him. The second year brought incremental progress. He enrolled in community college, taking night classes in horticulture and landscape design, the only skills from his lost years he wanted to keep, reclaimed now on his own terms. He found a therapist he trusted and attended sessions weekly without missing. He started going to Sunday dinners at his parents' house and staying past dessert, talking about his classes, his part-time work, the ordinary details of a life being rebuilt, one small brick at a time. Tom and Linda navigated their own healing. They'd grieved a dead son for 16 years and now had to adjust to a living one who wasn't the teenager they'd lost. They attended support groups for families of returned missing persons, where they learned that recovery isn't linear, that there's no timeline for healing, that sometimes love means accepting what can't be repaired. They learned to ask before hugging, to respect Aaron's need for space, to understand that his flinching at sudden movements wasn't rejection but reflex. The red scarf found a new place in their lives. Aaron kept it in his apartment for the first year, a tangible connection to the person he'd been. On the second anniversary of his return, he gave it back to Linda. She folded it carefully and placed it in a memory box with Aaron's baby blanket, his first basketball jersey, the Father's Day card he'd made in elementary school when he still drew stick figures. Objects hold meaning the way bodies hold scars, visible reminders of what happened and what survived. By 2020, Aaron had completed an associate degree in horticulture and was working part-time at a garden center while volunteering with the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Exploitation. He spoke at training sessions for law enforcement officers, social workers, and victim advocates, sharing his story to help others understand the invisible nature of labor trafficking, the long-term psychological impacts, the barriers to escape that aren't physical but no less real. His testimony helped shape new protocols for handling cases of presumed deceased missing persons. He worked with state legislators to draft what would become the Wisconsin Missing Persons Cross-Reference Act, requiring periodic automated checks of Social Security activity, employment records, medical databases, and driver's license applications for anyone listed as missing and presumed deceased. The protocols became known informally as Hartley checks in internal documents, though Aaron never sought recognition or publicity. He wanted systems that worked, policies that might prevent other families from losing 17 years. The epilogue to this story isn't neat closure, because real recovery never is. It's the ongoing work of living with what happened, of building a life forward while acknowledging what was lost. It's Tom teaching Aaron how to rebuild the carburetor on a lawnmower, passing along the mechanical knowledge he would have taught his teenage son if that son had come home. It's Linda texting Aaron every morning, just good morning, nothing more. A small ritual that says, I'm here, you're here, we're both still here. It's Aaron celebrating his 35th birthday in 2020 with a gathering of people who know his whole story and love him anyway. His parents, his therapist, 2 friends from community college, Detective Chen, who drove down from Cedar Grove with a card signed by the entire police department. The bridge over Cedar Creek still stands, repaired and reinforced over the years, but fundamentally unchanged. The Hartleys don't avoid it. Sometimes, driving past on their way to the grocery store or the library, Aaron will slow down, looking at the spot where his bicycle went into the ditch, where everything changed. He doesn't feel haunted by it anymore. he feels something more complicated. An acknowledgement that the boy who pedaled across that bridge on a December morning in 2001 didn't come back, and that's not entirely a tragedy. That boy didn't survive. But Aaron did. He adapted, endured, and became someone new, built from fragments of who he was, and the hard-earned knowledge of who he had to become. If someone you know has experienced a long-term disappearance, or if you're navigating the complex terrain of family reunification after trauma, resources exist. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children operates a family advocacy division with trained specialists in long-term cases. The Polaris Project runs a 24-hour trafficking hotline at 1-888-373-788. The International Center for Missing and Exploited Children provides resources for cross-border cases. The National Alliance to End Sexual Violence offers state-by-state directories of victim services. These organizations understand that finding someone is only the first step. The real work, the daily unglamorous work of rebuilding identity, trust, and safety, takes years, and it takes specialized support. Aaron Hartley knocked on his parents' door 17 years after he vanished, carrying a faded red scarf and a lifetime of survival. The story isn't about the miracle of return. It's about the relentless, unglamorous work of recovery, the systems that fail and occasionally catch, the families that grieve and then have to learn how to hope again in a completely new way. It's about the thousands of missing people whose cases sit in databases, waiting for a cross-reference, a flag, a discrepancy that might bring them home. Every automated check matters. Every protocol update matters. Every person who refuses to stop looking matters. The light on the Hartley porch still flickers. Tom finally fixed the wiring in 2019, but the new fixture has the same quirk, some things persisting despite our best efforts to change them. Aaron comes through that door now on his own terms, carrying groceries for Sunday dinner, texting when he's running late, calling to ask if they need anything from the hardware store. He's living the ordinary, unremarkable life that was stolen, and then, against all odds and despite every obstacle, reclaimed one small decision at a time. The red scarf sits folded in Linda's memory box, no longer a question mark, but a comma, not an ending, just a pause before the next part of the story begins.